You watch colleagues manipulate their way to the top, while your honest work goes unnoticed and unrewarded. Every day you see less qualified people command respect through intimidation and cunning, while you remain overlooked despite your superior contributions and moral character. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the man whose name became synonymous with political cunning and strategic ruthlessness. For over 500 years, my teachings have guided princes, presidents, and power brokers who understood that sometimes fear is more reliable than love. What I discovered about commanding respect through calculated fear will transform how others perceive and treat you in any situation where power dynamics matter. The same principles that helped rulers maintain kingdoms can help you establish unshakable authority in your professional and personal life. But first, like this video, subscribe for more political wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of influence. Let me tell you about the moment that shattered every idealistic notion I ever held about power and politics. In 1512, I was a respected civil servant in the Florentine Republic, a man who believed that virtue, merit, and dedication to the common good would ultimately triumph. I had spent 14 years serving my beloved Florence, working tirelessly to strengthen our republic, organize our defenses, and negotiate with foreign powers. I believed in the power of reason, in the nobility of public service, and in the fundamental goodness of political institutions. How naive I was. When the Medici family returned to power with the backing of Pope Julius II and Spanish forces, everything I had worked for crumbled overnight. The republic I had served so faithfully was dissolved, and suddenly I found myself not just unemployed, but suspected of conspiracy against a new regime. My years of loyal service meant nothing. My expertise in military affairs and diplomacy was seen not as an asset, but as a threat. In February 1513, they came for me. I was arrested on charges of plotting against the Medici, accused of participating in a conspiracy that I had no knowledge of. The irony was crushing. Jai, who had dedicated my life to legitimate governance, was now branded a traitor by those who had seized power through foreign intervention and force. But it was what happened next that truly opened my eyes to the brutal reality of power. They tortured me. 6 times they applied the strappado, hoisting me by my arms tied behind my back, dislocating my shoulders and sending waves of agony through my body. Each drop was designed to extract a confession to crimes I had never committed. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological revelation was even more devastating. In that dungeon, hanging from those chains, I understood for the first time that all my beliefs about justice, merit, and moral governance were nothing more than pretty fantasies. The men who tortured me weren't evil monsters. They were pragmatists who understood something I had refused to see. Power doesn't care about your intentions, your virtue, or your years of faithful service. Power only respects force and those who wield it effectively. During those long nights in my cell, listening to the screams of other prisoners and nursing my dislocated shoulders, I began to see the world as it truly was, rather than as I wished it to be. The Medici hadn't returned to power because they were more virtuous, or because their cause was just. They had returned because they understood the mathematics of force, the importance of alliances, and the value of inspiring fear in their enemies. I realized that my downfall hadn't been due to any moral failing or lack of competence. I had fallen because I had played by rules that didn't actually exist. While I was writing diplomatic letters and organizing citizen militias, my enemies were building networks of fear and dependency. While I was appealing to reason and justice, they were calculating how to make opposition too costly to contemplate. When I was finally released, I was a different man. The idealistic civil servant who had entered that prison was dead. In his place emerged someone who understood that to survive in a world of power, you must master the tools that power actually respects: fear, calculation, and the strategic application of force. My exile from Florence became my education in the true nature of political reality, and it was in this crucible of humiliation and pain that I began to formulate the principles that would later guide princes and presidents for centuries to come. It was during my exile that I encountered the man who would become my model for everything I would later teach about power: Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois. While Florence debated and deliberated, while other Italian states clung to outdated notions of honor and traditional authority, Cesare was carving out an empire through pure, calculated effectiveness. I had the opportunity to observe him closely during my diplomatic missions before my fall from grace, and what I witnessed was a masterclass in political realism that shattered every assumption I held about how power should work versus how it actually works. Cesare understood something that escaped most rulers of our time: that the gap between moral idealism and political effectiveness was not a flaw to be corrected, but a fundamental truth to be accepted and exploited. When Cesare entered the room, he didn't waste time winning hearts and minds through gradual reform or appeals to justice. He understood that fear creates stability where love creates vulnerability. I watched him eliminate his enemies, not through grand battles or heroic gestures, but through swift, decisive action that left no room for future rebellion. When the Orsini family plotted against him, he didn't engage in lengthy negotiations or attempt to win them over through concessions. He invited them to a peace conference and had them arrested and executed. It was brutal, efficient, and absolutely effective. What struck me most was how Caesar's seeming cruelty actually prevented far greater suffering. By eliminating threats decisively, he avoided the prolonged conflicts that plagued other territories. His subjects, who initially feared him, came to appreciate the stability his iron rule provided. Trade flourished, crime decreased, and the region prospered under his leadership. This was my first glimpse into the paradox that would become central to my political philosophy. Sometimes the most moral action is the one that appears most immoral. The moment that crystallized my understanding came when I witnessed Caesar's handling of his lieutenant, Ramiro de Orco. Ramiro had been ruthlessly effective in pacifying the Romunia, but his cruelty had begun to generate resentment that threatened Caesar's long-term stability. Rather than defend his lieutenant or gradually reassign him, Cesare had Ramiro executed publicly, his body displayed in the town square cut in half. The message was unmistakable. Even those who served the Duke were not above his justice. This single act revealed the sophisticated psychology behind effective leadership. Cesare had used Ramiro to accomplish the dirty work of pacification, then sacrificed him to redirect public anger away from himself. The people who had hated Ramiro's cruelty suddenly saw Cesare as their protector rather than their oppressor. It was manipulation of the highest order, and it worked perfectly. In that moment, I understood that morality and politics exist in separate spheres. The ruler who tries to apply personal virtue to political action will inevitably fail, not because virtue is wrong, but because the political sphere operates according to different rules. A prince who refuses to lie will be defeated by those who lie strategically. A leader who will not use force will be overthrown by those who understand when force is necessary. This realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. It meant abandoning the comfortable illusion that good intentions and moral purity would somehow triumph over calculation and strategic thinking. But it also meant gaining access to tools of influence that actually worked in the real world. Tools that could be used not just for personal advancement, but for the greater stability and prosperity of the state itself. The first, and perhaps most crucial lesson I learned from observing effective rulers is this: Predictability makes you vulnerable to manipulation, while calculated unpredictability makes others dependent on your favor and fearful of your displeasure. Most people operate under the illusion that consistency in behavior builds trust and respect. This is fundamentally backwards. Consistency builds familiarity, and familiarity breeds contempt and exploitation. I discovered this principle through painful personal experience. During my years as a civil servant, I prided myself on being reliable, consistent, and transparent in my dealings. I believed this would earn me respect and trust. Instead, it made me easy to circumvent and ultimately easy to discard. My colleagues knew exactly how I would react to any given situation, which made me predictable and therefore powerless. Cesare Borgia, by contrast, was a master of strategic inconsistency. One day he would show mercy to a captured enemy, pardoning them publicly and restoring their lands. The next, he would execute a similar offender without warning. His subordinates never knew whether their mistakes would be overlooked or punished severely. This uncertainty created a constant state of vigilance and deference among those around him. But here's what most people misunderstand about this principle. Unpredictability is not randomness. Caesar's actions weren't arbitrary, they were calculated to achieve specific psychological effects. When he showed mercy, it was to demonstrate his magnanimity and encourage others to surrender rather than fight to the death. When he showed severity, it was to remind everyone that his mercy was a gift, not a right, and that crossing him carried real consequences. The key is to be unpredictable in your methods while remaining absolutely consistent in your ultimate objectives. People should never be certain how you will achieve your goals, but they should have no doubt that you will achieve them. This creates a productive anxiety that keeps others attentive to your moods and careful about opposing your interests. In modern applications, this principle transforms how you navigate workplace dynamics and negotiations. Instead of being the person who always says yes to requests, sometimes you accommodate immediately. Sometimes you require extensive justification, and sometimes you decline altogether. The pattern isn't random, you're training others to present better cases and to value your cooperation more highly because they can never take it for granted. I learned to apply this in my own diplomatic correspondence during my exile. Rather than always responding to letters immediately, I would sometimes reply within hours, and sometimes wait weeks, depending on what psychological effect I wanted to create. When I wanted to signal that someone's communication was particularly important to me, rapid response conveyed eagerness. When I wanted to establish that I had other priorities and couldn't be rushed, delayed response created respect for my time and attention. The most sophisticated application involves varying your emotional responses. Never become known as someone who is always calm, always angry, or always enthusiastic. Instead, let your emotions appear to be triggered by specific circumstances that others must learn to read and navigate. When people can't predict whether their actions will be met with approval, indifference, or displeasure, they become much more careful about how they interact with you. This unpredictability must extend to your decision-making patterns as well. Sometimes you should make quick decisions to demonstrate decisiveness. Other times, you should deliberate extensively to show thoroughness. Sometimes, you should consult widely to appear collaborative. Other times, you should decide unilaterally to establish your authority. The key is that others should never be able to assume which approach you'll take in any given situation. The psychological effect is profound. People begin to study your moods, analyze your preferences, and modify their behavior to avoid triggering negative responses. They become invested in maintaining your favor because they cannot predict when that favor might be withdrawn. This is not manipulation for its own sake, it's the establishment of a dynamic where others must continuously earn your attention and cooperation rather than taking it for granted. The goal of calculated unpredictability is not to create chaos or confusion, but to generate what I call productive anxiety, a state where others are motivated to please you because they cannot predict when their actions might fall short of your expectations. This is fundamentally different from the destructive anxiety created by tyrants who punish randomly and without reason. Productive anxiety keeps people alert, engaged, and careful about their interactions with you. It makes them think twice before making requests, consider their words more carefully, and put genuine effort into understanding what you value. When done correctly, this doesn't make you feared in the sense of being hated, makes you respected as someone whose approval is valuable because it cannot be easily obtained or maintained. I learned this distinction through observing the different effects created by various rulers I encountered. Those who were genuinely unpredictable, whose reactions seemed random and disconnected from any logical pattern, created only resentment and the desire to escape their influence. But those who were strategically unpredictable, whose patterns could be discerned by careful observation but never fully predicted, created deep engagement and loyalty. The key is to establish that your responses are connected to real factors that others can influence, but that those factors are complex enough that success requires genuine attention and effort. For instance, you might respond favorably to proposals that show thorough research, creative thinking, and consideration of potential problems, but sometimes you emphasize research, sometimes creativity, and sometimes risk management, depending on circumstances that others must learn to read. This approach transforms your professional relationships by elevating the quality of interactions. When people know they cannot predict your response, they prepare more thoroughly, think more carefully, and present their best work. They cannot rely on charm, habit, or assumption to carry them through interactions with you. The timing of your responses becomes a crucial tool in this process. Sometimes immediate feedback rewards promptness and shows engagement. Other times, delayed response creates anticipation and demonstrates that you don't make hasty judgments. The pattern should be discernible to careful observers, but never so obvious that it becomes predictable. Your physical presence and body language also contribute to this dynamic. Sometimes you should be completely accessible and warm in your interactions. Other times, you should be formal and somewhat distant. Sometimes you should ask detailed questions about others' work and lives. Other times, you should be focused entirely on immediate business. People should feel that gaining your full attention and approval is an achievement that requires reading the situation correctly. But here's what separates productive anxiety from mere manipulation. You must genuinely care about the outcomes and quality of work that others produce. Your unpredictability should push them toward excellence, not just toward pleasing you. When your standards are high and your methods for evaluating success are sophisticated, people rise to meet those standards. The most powerful aspect of productive anxiety is that it becomes self-reinforcing. When people experience the satisfaction of earning your genuine approval through excellent work, they become motivated to achieve that satisfaction again. They begin to internalize higher standards because they've experienced the rewards of meeting them. This creates a positive cycle where your unpredictability encourages others to develop better judgment, more thorough preparation, and greater sensitivity to quality and context. Over time, those who work with you become more capable and effective because they've learned to operate at a higher level of attention and care. The ultimate goal is to be seen as someone whose approval is both valuable and challenging to obtain, not because you're arbitrary or impossible to please, but because you hold complex, sophisticated standards that require genuine effort and skill to meet. When you achieve this position, people don't fear you in the sense of wanting to avoid you. Instead, they fear disappointing you because your opinion matters, and they've learned that earning your respect requires their best effort. Information is the ultimate currency of power, more valuable than gold, more decisive than armies, and more enduring than formal authority. During my years of exile, when I had lost all official position and influence, I maintained relevance and even gained power through one simple principle. I knew more about what was happening than anyone else, and I was strategic about what I revealed. And when my network of correspondence throughout Italy became my lifeline and my weapon, while others relied on rumors and official proclamations, I cultivated relationships with merchants, diplomats, soldiers, and servants who could provide me with accurate, timely intelligence about political developments, military movements, and personal scandals. This information became my currency for rebuilding influence even without formal position. The key insight is that knowledge of others' secrets creates invisible chains of influence that are often stronger than legal authority or financial leverage. When you know something that someone desperately wants to keep hidden, you don't need to threaten them explicitly. The mere fact that you possess this knowledge creates a permanent dynamic where they must consider your interests in their decision-making. But information control goes far beyond gathering secrets. It's about becoming the person others rely on for accurate intelligence about situations that matter to them. When people know that you consistently possess better information than they do, they begin to defer to your judgment, even in areas where you have no formal expertise. I learned to cultivate sources at every level of society. Kitchen servants often knew more about their master's real financial situations than the master's own advisors. Stable boys could tell you which diplomats were secretly meeting, and which alliances were being formed before any official negotiations began. Prostitutes knew which powerful men had weaknesses that could be exploited, and which marriages were in trouble. The most valuable information is often the kind that people don't realize they're revealing. A casual comment about someone's travel plans can tell you about secret negotiations. A complaint about late payments can reveal financial pressures that might force policy changes. An observation about someone's health can help you predict when opportunities for advancement might arise. But gathering information is only half the equation. The strategic revelation of what you know is equally important. You must demonstrate your superior knowledge without revealing your sources or the full extent of what you understand. This creates the impression that your intelligence network is even more extensive than it actually is. I developed the practice of dropping small, specific details into conversations that would surprise others with my knowledge, while making them wonder what else I might know. If someone mentioned a recent meeting, I might casually reference who else was present or what was served for dinner deals that proved I had inside information without revealing how I obtained it. The goal is to create a reputation for omniscience that exceeds your actual capabilities. When people believe you know everything, they begin to behave as if you actually do. They become more careful about what they say and do, more honest in their dealings with you, and more inclined to share information with you in hopes of gaining your favor or avoiding your displeasure. This dynamic also protects you from deception. When people assume you already know the truth, they're less likely to lie to you. They begin to volunteer information and confess mistakes rather than risk being caught in deceptions that might damage their relationship with you. The most sophisticated practitioners understand that controlling information flow means being strategic about ignorance as well as knowledge. Sometimes it's advantageous to appear uninformed about certain topics, either to encourage others to reveal more than they intended, or to avoid being held responsible for acting on information you're not supposed to possess. Building your personal intelligence network requires understanding that information flows along predictable channels, and that the most valuable intelligence often comes from sources that others overlook or undervalue. During my exile, I discovered that the people with the best information are rarely those in the most obvious positions of authority. The first principle is to cultivate sources at multiple levels of any organization or social structure. The executive assistant often knows more about a leader's real priorities and schedule than their official deputies. The accountant understands the true financial pressures better than anyone else. The maintenance staff sees who arrives early, stays late, and meets privately after hours. I learned to pay attention to casual conversations and social gatherings where people let their guard down. A complaint about working late reveals project priorities. A joke about someone's drinking habits might indicate personal problems that could affect professional performance. An offhand comment about vacation plans can tell you when someone will be absent during crucial decision-making periods. The key is to be genuinely interested in people and their perspectives, not just in what they can tell you. When people feel heard and valued, they naturally share more information. They begin to see you as someone who understands their world and appreciates their insights. This creates a relationship where information flows naturally rather than through obvious interrogation. Reading between the lines becomes a crucial skill. What people don't say is often more revealing than what they do say. When someone avoids mentioning a colleague who used to feature prominently in their stories, it suggests tension or falling out. When they suddenly start speaking positively about someone they previously criticized, it indicates a shift in political alignment. You must also learn to verify information through multiple sources without revealing that you're doing so. Independent confirmation protects you from acting on false intelligence, while also helping you identify which sources are most reliable. The most dangerous mistake is acting decisively on information that turns out to be wrong. Creating dependency through exclusive access to information becomes a powerful tool for building influence. When you consistently provide others with intelligence they cannot obtain elsewhere, they become reliant on your network. They begin to consult you before making decisions and include you in planning discussions because your input has proven valuable. But the most sophisticated aspect of information control involves managing what others know about your knowledge. You want people to understand that you have excellent sources without knowing exactly who those sources are or how extensive your network really is. This protects your sources while maximizing the psychological impact of your intelligence capabilities. I developed the practice of sharing information in ways that demonstrated its value while encouraging reciprocity. If I learned something that would benefit someone I wanted to cultivate as a source, I would share it in a way that showed both my knowledge and my goodwill. This created a relationship where they felt obligated to return the favor with information of their own. The timing of information sharing is crucial. Sometimes immediate sharing shows that you value the relationship and want to be helpful. Other times, strategic delays demonstrate that you evaluate information carefully and don't act impulsively. Sometimes sharing incomplete information encourages others to fill in the gaps, revealing additional intelligence in the process. You must also understand the difference between information that loses value when shared and information that gains value through strategic revelation. A secret about someone's personal life might be most valuable when kept private and used to influence their behavior. But intelligence about market trends or political developments might be most valuable when shared with the right people at the right time to position yourself as an insightful advisor. The ultimate goal is to become the person others turn to when they need to understand what's really happening. When you achieve this position, information begins to flow to you automatically because people know you're someone who can provide context, verification, and additional insights that help them make better decisions. The most difficult lesson I've learned through my political education is that loyalty must be conditional for survival, and that those who refuse to abandon failing partnerships will inevitably be dragged down with them. This doesn't make you disloyal, it makes you realistic about the temporary nature of all political relationships and the necessity of adapting to changing circumstances. I observed this principle most clearly through watching how the most successful rulers treated their alliances. They understood that partnerships exist to serve mutual interests. And when those interests diverge, or when one party becomes a liability, the alliance must be reconsidered. The ruler who clings to outdated loyalties out of sentiment or moral obligation will find themselves isolated and powerless when circumstances change. Cesare Borgia was a master of this principle. He formed alliances with the Orsini family when their support served his expansion into the Romagna, but when their ambitions began to conflict with his consolidation of power, he didn't hesitate to eliminate them. He understood that loyalty is a tool of statecraft, not an end in itself, and that the greatest loyalty a leader can show to their cause is refusing to let personal attachments compromise strategic objectives. The key insight is that apparent betrayal is often the most loyal act possible when viewed from the perspective of larger goals. If maintaining a personal alliance will harm your ability to serve the broader interests you're responsible for, then the truly loyal choice is to sacrifice the personal relationship for the greater good. But strategic alliance management requires more sophistication than simple opportunism. You must appear loyal while preparing alternative options. Maintain multiple potential partnerships simultaneously, and position yourself as indispensable rather than merely useful. The goal is to create a situation where others need you more than you need them, giving you leverage to shape the terms of cooperation. I learned to cultivate relationships with people who might become useful in different scenarios. During my diplomatic career, I maintained correspondence with officials who served opposing political factions, not because I intended to betray my employers, but because political fortunes change rapidly and today's enemy often becomes tomorrow's necessary partner. The art lies in maintaining these relationships without compromising your current obligations. You must be genuinely helpful and reliable to your present allies, while keeping communication open with potential future partners. This requires careful management of information and avoiding commitments that would prevent you from adapting to new circumstances. When circumstances do require abandoning an alliance, the manner of departure is crucial. You want to minimize resentment while preserving your reputation for future partnerships. Sometimes this means providing advance warning that allows your former ally to adjust their plans. Other times it means making the break clean and decisive. To avoid prolonged conflict, the most sophisticated practitioners understand that ending one alliance can actually strengthen others. When potential partners see that you're willing to make difficult choices based on strategic considerations rather than personal sentiment, they gain confidence in your judgment and reliability. They know that if they maintain mutual benefit, you'll be a steadfast ally. But they also understand that the relationship depends on continued value rather than mere habit. You must also learn to recognize when others are preparing to abandon you. The signs are often subtle: decreased communication frequency, reluctance to make long-term commitments, sudden interest in your other relationships, or requests for favors that seem designed to extract final value from the partnership. Recognizing these patterns early allows you to adjust your own strategy rather than being caught off guard. The psychological challenge is separating personal affection from strategic assessment. You may genuinely like someone who has become a political liability, or you may personally dislike someone whose alliance has become necessary. Effective leadership requires making these distinctions clearly and acting on strategic considerations, regardless of personal preferences. This doesn't mean becoming coldly calculating about all relationships. Instead, it means understanding which relationships exist primarily for strategic purposes and managing them accordingly, while maintaining separate spaces for purely personal connections that aren't subject to political considerations. The true art of strategic alliance lies not in any single partnership, but in positioning yourself as the valuable connecting point between different, often opposing forces. During my diplomatic missions, I discovered that the most powerful individuals weren't those who commanded the largest armies or controlled the most territory, but those who had made themselves indispensable to multiple parties with conflicting interests. Reading the true intentions behind others' promises requires understanding that what people say they want is often different from what they actually need, and that both may differ from what they're willing to sacrifice to achieve their goals. Every negotiation contains multiple layers of communication: the official position, the actual position, and the fallback position that reveals their true priorities. I learned to listen for what people emphasized and what they glossed over quickly. When someone spends considerable time explaining why a particular point isn't really important to them, it usually means the opposite. When they make grand statements about principles while focusing negotiations on minor details, the details reveal their real concerns. The ability to maintain multiple potential alliances simultaneously requires compartmentalization and careful information management. You must understand what each party values and what they fear. Then position yourself as someone who can provide value while protecting them from their fears. This often means serving as a bridge between groups that cannot openly cooperate. During the complex negotiations surrounding the League of Cambrai, I observed how the most successful diplomats managed to appear committed to each side while preserving flexibility to adapt as circumstances changed. They achieved this by making their commitments conditional on factors that allowed for reinterpretation as situations evolved. The power of being indispensable versus merely useful becomes clear when alliances face pressure. Useful partners can be replaced. Indispensable ones cannot. You become indispensable by developing unique capabilities, exclusive relationships, or specialized knowledge that others cannot easily replicate. This might mean becoming the only person who can communicate effectively with a difficult but important ally, or developing expertise in an area that everyone needs but few understand. I cultivated relationships with figures who had influence in multiple courts, not because I planned to betray anyone, but because political landscapes shift rapidly, and today's enemy often becomes tomorrow's necessary partner. These relationships allowed me to serve as an unofficial channel of communication when official diplomacy became impossible. The most sophisticated aspect of this approach involves creating situations where different parties compete for your favor rather than taking your support for granted. When multiple groups believe they need your cooperation more than you need theirs, you gain leverage to shape the terms of engagement with all of them. This requires understanding the competitive dynamics between the parties you're dealing with. If you know the two potential allies are rivals, you can position yourself as the prize they compete for, rather than as a supplicant seeking their support. Your attention, cooperation, and information become resources they must earn rather than benefits they can assume. The timing of your commitments becomes crucial in this process. Premature commitment limits your options and reduces your value to other parties, but excessive delay can cause all parties to seek alternatives. The skill lies in maintaining enough ambiguity to preserve your options while providing enough assurance to keep others invested in winning your support. You must also develop the ability to recognize when apparent opponents might actually become valuable allies. Political enemies often share common interests that aren't immediately obvious. Two people who compete for the same promotion might both benefit from cooperating to change the criteria for advancement. Two departments that fight over budget allocations might both gain from working together to increase the overall budget. The ultimate goal is to create a network of relationships where your success enhances rather than threatens the success of others, while positioning yourself as someone whose opposition would be costly and whose friendship provides genuine benefits. When you achieve this position, others become invested in your continued success because it serves their own interests. The most misunderstood aspect of leadership through fear is that effective consequences must be public, memorable, and absolutely proportional to serve as genuine deterrents, rather than merely expressions of anger or frustration. During my observations of successful rulers, I learned that those who wielded power most effectively were not the cruelest, but those who understood exactly when and how to make examples that would prevent far greater suffering later. Cesar Borgia's execution of Ramiro de Orco taught me that the purpose of public consequences is not personal satisfaction or emotional release, but strategic communication. Every act of punishment sends multiple messages to the person being punished, to potential future offenders, to your supporters, and to your enemies. The most effective leaders carefully craft these messages to achieve specific behavioral changes. The psychology of deterrence requires that consequences be certain, swift, and clearly connected to specific behaviors rather than general displeasure. When punishment appears random or disconnected from clear violations, it creates resentment and rebellion rather than compliance. But when consequences follow predictably from specific actions, they create a rational framework where people can choose their outcomes through their behavior. I studied the difference between effective punishment and counterproductive cruelty by observing rulers who succeeded in maintaining order versus those who provoked uprisings despite having superior force. The successful ones established clear rules, communicated expectations explicitly, and then enforced consequences without exception or favoritism. The failures either failed to establish clear standards or enforced them inconsistently based on mood or personal preference. The key insight is that mercy without the credible threat of severity is merely weakness, while severity without the possibility of mercy becomes tyranny. The most effective approach combines both: clear standards that are enforced consistently, but with room for redemption when someone demonstrates genuine change in behavior and attitude. When I witnessed handling of rebellious cities, I noticed that he always offered terms for surrender before resorting to force. Those who accepted his authority were treated well. Those who resisted faced devastating consequences. This created a rational choice where submission was rewarded and defiance was punished, encouraging others to choose cooperation rather than risk destruction. The selection of who receives public consequences is crucial. You cannot punish everyone who violates your standards, so you must choose examples that will have the maximum deterrent effect. Sometimes this means making an example of someone important to demonstrate that no one is above the rules. Other times it means punishing someone who others respect to show that good intentions don't excuse bad behavior. The manner of consequence must match the severity of the violation and the importance of the message you're sending. Minor infractions require proportional responses that correct behavior without creating lasting resentment. Major violations require responses severe enough to deter repetition and demonstrate to others that such behavior will not be tolerated. But the most sophisticated aspect of this principle involves understanding that the threat of consequences is often more powerful than their actual implementation. When people believe that crossing you will result in certain and painful consequences, most will choose not to test that belief. This means that a reputation for decisive action can often prevent the need for actual punishment. I learned that building this reputation requires following through on your stated consequences without exception when they are tested. Even if you would prefer to show mercy, the credibility of all your future threats depends on consistency in enforcement. People must believe that your warnings are not bluffs. The timing of consequences matters enormously. Immediate punishment after a violation creates the strongest association between action and result, but sometimes delayed consequences can be more effective because they demonstrate that you don't forget offenses and that, escape is impossible, even if not immediate. You must also understand the difference between consequences that reform behavior and those that simply eliminate problems. Sometimes the goal is to change someone's actions while maintaining the relationship. Other times, the goal is to remove them from a position where they can cause further damage. While sending a message to others about what behavior will not be tolerated, the ultimate purpose is to create an environment where rational people choose to cooperate because the benefits of alignment clearly outweigh the costs of opposition. When you achieve this balance, most discipline becomes self-imposed as people internalize your standards and police their own behavior to avoid negative consequences. The strategic selection of your battles and your targets determines whether your use of consequences builds lasting authority or merely creates temporary compliance, followed by deeper resentment. During my time organizing Florence's militia, I learned that the connection between fear and force must be carefully managed to create respect rather than rebellion. Choosing your battles strategically means understanding that not every violation deserves public response, and that some fights will cost more than they gain even if you win them. The most effective leaders pick conflicts they can win decisively with proportional effort, while avoiding confrontations that would drain resources without advancing their larger objectives. I observed that Cesare Borgia never engaged in fights with uncertain outcomes when he could avoid them. He preferred to create situations where his victory was inevitable before committing to conflict. This wasn't cowardice, was strategic wisdom that preserved his resources for battles that truly mattered while building a reputation for invincibility. The importance of proportional response cannot be overstated. Punishment that exceeds the severity of the offense creates sympathy for the offender and suggests that you lack judgment or self-control. Punishment that falls short of the offense's seriousness suggests weakness and invites further testing. The response must fit the violation closely enough that observers see it as justice rather than arbitrary exercise of power. When selecting targets for public consequences, you must consider both the direct effect on that individual and the message it sends to others. Sometimes the best target is someone who is respected but has clearly violated your standards, because their punishment demonstrates that rules apply equally to everyone. Other times, the best target is someone who others dislike but who has crossed clear lines, because their punishment will be seen as justified rather than vindictive. I learned that the most powerful examples often come from punishing people who thought they were protected by their relationships, their past service, or their value to the organization. When someone believes they are immune to consequences and discovers they are wrong, it sends a powerful message to others who might have similar assumptions about their own immunity. But you must ensure that your examples serve as effective warnings, rather than creating martyrs. The person you punish should be someone whose downfall others see as preventable through better choices, not as an inevitable result of serving you. If people conclude that loyalty and good service provide no protection, they will begin planning their own escapes rather than committing to excellence. The goal is to establish a reputation that precedes you into every negotiation and interaction. When people know that crossing you results in certain and appropriate consequences, most will choose not to test that knowledge. This reputation becomes a form of soft power that makes actual punishment less necessary over time. Building this reputation requires consistency across different relationships and situations. You cannot be lenient with friends while being harsh with others, or strict about some rules while ignoring violations of others. The pattern must be clear enough that people can predict consequences based on actions rather than relationships or circumstances. I discovered that the most effective approach involves escalating consequences for repeated violations rather than applying maximum punishment immediately. This gives people opportunities to correct their behavior while making it clear that continued problems will result in increasingly severe responses. It demonstrates both fairness and determination. The timing of when you enforce consequences can dramatically affect their impact. Sometimes immediate response is necessary to prevent others from concluding that the behavior is acceptable. Other times, allowing a brief period for reflection and potential self-correction can make the eventual consequence more powerful because the person had a chance to avoid it. You must also understand that effective consequence requires follow-through beyond the immediate punishment. The person who has been corrected must have a clear path to redemption that doesn't require them to lose face completely, while the broader community must see that the standards that led to the consequence remain in effect. Perception often matters more than reality in the exercise of power, and those who master the theater of authority can achieve through careful staging what others cannot accomplish through superior resources or formal position. During my diplomatic missions, I learned that how you present yourself and orchestrate interactions often determines outcomes more than the substance of what you're discussing. The physical environment where you meet with others communicates messages about power dynamics before any words are spoken. When Pope Julius II received ambassadors in the Sistine Chapel, surrounded by Michelangelo's frescoes depicting divine authority, he was using architecture to reinforce his spiritual and temporal power. The grandeur created an atmosphere where resistance seemed not just futile but sacrilegious. I learned to pay careful attention to how successful rulers staged their encounters for maximum psychological impact. They understood that setting, timing, and audience could transform the meaning of any interaction. A private meeting suggests intimacy and special access. A public audience implies that the conversation has broader significance. The choice of location, your office, neutral ground, or their territory immediately establishes power dynamics. The importance of timing extends beyond simple punctuality to the strategic use of schedule and sequence. Making someone wait demonstrates that your time is more valuable than theirs, but excessive delays can backfire by suggesting disorganization or disrespect. The most sophisticated practitioners arrive precisely when their entrance will have maximum impact. During my observations of Cesare Borgia's court, I noticed how he orchestrated the sequence of meetings to create specific impressions. Important allies were received early in the day when he was fresh and could give them full attention. Potential enemies were scheduled late when fatigue might make them more agreeable to his terms. Neutral parties were seen in groups where they could observe his interactions with others and draw conclusions about his power and temperament. The audience present during important conversations dramatically affects their outcome. Private discussions allow for honesty and negotiation that might be impossible with witnesses. But public interactions create pressure for both parties to maintain positions that protect their reputations. Sometimes you want witnesses to ensure that agreements are honored. Other times, you want privacy to allow face-saving compromises. I learned to create an aura of inevitability around my decisions by presenting them as conclusions I had reached. After careful consideration rather than preferences I hoped others would accept. This involves the language you use, the confidence in your voice, and the way you respond to objections. When people believe that your mind is made up based on factors they cannot change, they focus on adapting to your decision rather than trying to change it. The strategic use of documentation and ceremony reinforces the permanence and importance of agreements. A handshake might be forgotten or reinterpreted, but a signed document in the presence of witnesses creates lasting commitment. The formality of the process communicates how seriously you take the matter and how seriously you expect others to take it. Your personal presentational clothing, posture, facial expression, and tone of voice must align with the message you want to send. Casual dress suggests accessibility but might undermine authority. Formal attire commands respect, but can create distance. The key is matching your presentation to your objectives for each specific interaction. I discovered that the most powerful leaders understood how to use silence and calculated pauses to create tension and focus attention. When someone finishes speaking and you remain quiet for several seconds before responding, it suggests that you're carefully considering their words while making them wonder what you're thinking. This brief discomfort often prompts them to add information or make concessions they hadn't planned to offer. The physical arrangement of furniture and seating can reinforce or undermine your authority. Sitting behind a desk creates formality and distance. Sitting across from someone at a table suggests negotiation between equals. Standing while others sit can establish dominance, but may also appear aggressive. The choice should support your strategic objectives for the interaction. Creating theatrical moments that people remember requires understanding what will seem significant to your specific audience. For some, it might be the casual mention of important connections. For others, it might be demonstrated expertise or exclusive information. The goal is to create an impression that lingers after the meeting ends and influences how they think about future interactions with you. The subtle aspects of physical presence, body language, voice, and bearing often communicate more about your authority than your words or formal position. During my years observing powerful figures across Italy, I learned that those who commanded genuine respect had mastered the art of presence in ways that made others naturally defer to them, even in informal settings. Your posture speaks before you do. When you enter a room, the way you carry yourself immediately signals confidence or uncertainty, authority or deference. I observed that effective leaders maintained straight spines and controlled movements, regardless of their internal state. They understood that physical confidence creates psychological confidence in both themselves and others. The strategic use of eye contact becomes a powerful tool for establishing dominance or building connection, depending on your objectives. Direct, sustained eye contact while speaking demonstrates conviction and demands attention, but looking away while others speak can suggest either thoughtful consideration or dismissive disinterest, depending on the context and your other signals. Voice control extends far beyond volume to include pace, tone, and strategic pauses. Speaking slightly more slowly than feels natural creates an impression of thoughtfulness and authority, forcing others to slow down and pay attention. Lowering your voice can be more commanding than raising it, because it requires others to focus more carefully on your words. I learned that the most sophisticated practitioners understood how to use silence as a form of communication. When someone asks you a difficult question, a pause before responding suggests that you're considering your words carefully rather than reacting defensively. When someone makes a proposal, remaining quiet can create pressure for them to improve their offer or reveal additional information. Reading and responding to others' unconscious signals of submission or defiance requires understanding the subtle indicators that reveal people's true attitudes, regardless of their words. Crossed arms, backward leaning, or avoiding eye contact often indicate resistance or discomfort. Forward leaning, open posture, and consistent eye contact suggest engagement and receptivity. The ability to mirror and then lead others' energy levels allows you to influence the mood and pace of interactions. If someone is agitated, matching their energy briefly before gradually slowing down can help calm them. If someone is lethargic, you can energize them by demonstrating enthusiasm while remaining controlled. During negotiations, I observed how master diplomats use their physical presence to reinforce their verbal messages. When making concessions, they would lean back slightly and speak more softly, suggesting reluctance and making the concessions seem more valuable. When stating firm positions, they would lean forward and speak more deliberately, emphasizing their commitment. The strategic management of your emotional displays becomes crucial for maintaining authority while remaining relatable. Complete emotional control can make you seem inhuman, but excessive emotional expression can undermine your credibility. The key is allowing others to see that you have feelings, while maintaining clear control over how those feelings affect your behavior. Understanding personal space and its psychological effects allows you to create comfort or pressure as needed. Standing slightly closer than social convention suggests can create intimacy or intimidation, depending on the context. Maintaining greater distance can show respect or create formality. The choice should support your strategic objectives. I learned that the most powerful aspect of presence involves making others feel that they have your complete attention when you choose to give it to them. In our distracted age, focused attention has become increasingly rare and valuable. When someone feels truly heard and considered, they often become more cooperative and receptive to your influence. The goal is to develop a presence that makes others naturally want to please you, not because they fear punishment, but because they value your approval and want to maintain their standing in your estimation. This requires projecting both strength and fairness, making it clear that you have high standards, while also demonstrating that those standards are achievable through genuine effort. This type of presence becomes self-reinforcing. When people begin to defer to your authority naturally, it reinforces your own confidence, which makes your presence even more commanding. Over time, you develop an authentic authority that doesn't depend on artificial techniques because it has become part of your natural bearing. The principles I have shared with you remain as relevant today as they were in Renaissance Italy, but their application requires understanding how power dynamics have evolved, while human nature has remained fundamentally unchanged. In contemporary organizations, the same psychological principles that governed princes and republics continue to determine who rises and who falls. Though the methods have become more subtle and the consequences less dramatic, the modern workplace operates under the same fundamental dynamics I observed in Italian courts. Those who understand how to inspire both respect and caution advance more quickly than those who rely solely on competence or good intentions. Your colleagues may not face exile or execution, but they can certainly face marginalization, lost opportunities, and career stagnation if they fail to navigate organizational politics effectively. Understanding when fear is necessary versus when it becomes destructive requires recognizing that productive fear motivates excellence, while destructive fear paralyzes initiative. In today's collaborative environments, you want others to fear disappointing you, not to fear approaching you. The goal is to be seen as someone whose approval is valuable and whose displeasure has consequences. Without becoming someone people avoid or undermine, the ethics of fear-based leadership in modern contexts must account for the reality that authority, without the ability to inspire appropriate caution, often becomes ineffective. Leaders who cannot establish clear consequences for poor performance create environments where mediocrity flourishes and high performers become frustrated. The most ethical approach often involves using strategic intimidation to maintain standards that benefit everyone. Contemporary applications require adapting these principles to environments with more formal constraints and greater transparency than Renaissance politics. You cannot simply eliminate opponents, but you can certainly ensure that opposing you becomes uncomfortable and unrewarding. You cannot control information completely, but you can become known as someone who is always better informed than others. Expect in corporate settings, calculated unpredictability might involve varying your response times to requests, alternating between detailed feedback and high-level direction, or changing the criteria you emphasize in evaluating work. The goal is to keep others attentive to your preferences while preventing them from taking your support for granted. Information control in modern organizations focuses on becoming the person others consult for context, interpretation, and insight, rather than just basic facts. While information is more widely available than in my era, the ability to synthesize, verify, and provide strategic perspective remains as valuable as ever. People still need someone who can help them understand what information really means. Strategic alliance management applies directly to matrix organizations, cross-functional teams, and the complex networks of influence that characterize modern business. The ability to maintain productive relationships with multiple stakeholders while adapting to changing priorities remains essential for advancement and effectiveness. The demonstration of consequences has evolved from public executions to performance reviews, project assignments, access to information, and inclusion in important decisions. The principle remains the same: clear standards, consistently enforced, create environments where rational people choose excellent performance over mediocrity. The theater of power now includes virtual presence, email communication, and social media representation, but the fundamental importance of controlling how others perceive your authority remains unchanged. Your Zoom presence, your email signature, and your LinkedIn profile all contribute to the impression you create about your competence and influence. The key adaptation involves understanding that modern authority must appear more collaborative and inclusive while remaining fundamentally effective. You must master the art of achieving compliance through apparent consensus, of directing outcomes while seeming to facilitate discussion, and of maintaining control while encouraging input. This requires developing more sophisticated psychological skills than my contemporaries needed. You must be able to read virtual body language, build relationships through digital communication, and influence decisions in environments where formal hierarchy provides less protection than it once did. The ultimate goal remains the same: creating a situation where others choose to support your objectives, because the benefits of alignment clearly outweigh the costs of opposition, while ensuring that those benefits and costs are obvious enough to guide rational decision-making. The greatest danger in mastering these principles is becoming what you initially sought to control, a person so focused on maintaining power that you lose sight of why power is worth having. Throughout history, I have watched leaders who began with noble intentions gradually transform into the very tyrants they once opposed, destroyed by their own success at wielding influence. The corruption of power follows a predictable pattern that I observed repeatedly in Renaissance Italy. First, leaders discover that fear-based tactics work more quickly than persuasion or collaboration. Then they begin to prefer these methods because they seem more efficient. Eventually, they become unable to achieve objectives any other way because they have destroyed the trust and goodwill necessary for voluntary cooperation. Maintaining respect while avoiding hatred requires understanding the crucial distinction between being feared for your standards and being feared for your unpredictability. People can respect and even admire someone who holds them to high expectations and enforces clear consequences, but they will eventually rebel against someone whose anger seems random or whose punishments appear disconnected from rational standards. The difference between being feared and being despised lies in whether others believe your use of power serves purposes beyond your own ego and immediate convenience. When people see that your authority is directed toward objectives they can understand and even support, they may fear disappointing you while still respecting your leadership. When they conclude that your power serves only your personal whims, fear transforms into resentment and active opposition. I learned this lesson by observing rulers who fell despite having superior resources and strategic positions. They shared a common characteristic: they had become so focused on maintaining their power that they forgot why they had sought it in the first place. Their subjects concluded that these leaders served no purpose beyond their own dominance, making rebellion seem like a moral duty rather than mere political opportunism. The psychological warning signs of this transformation include finding yourself enjoying others' discomfort for its own sake rather than as a necessary tool for achieving important objectives. When you begin to take pleasure in demonstrations of your power separate from their strategic value, you are moving toward tyranny rather than leadership. Another critical indicator is losing the ability to tolerate disagreement or questioning, even when it comes from people whose loyalty and competence you have reason to trust. Effective leaders maintain relationships with people who will tell them uncomfortable truths. Tyrants surround themselves with sycophants who provide only confirmation and praise. The isolation that comes with excessive reliance on fear-based leadership becomes self-reinforcing. As people become afraid to share bad news or dissenting opinions, you lose access to the information you need to make good decisions. Your judgment deteriorates, leading to more mistakes, which require more severe enforcement, creating a cycle that eventually destroys both effectiveness and legitimacy. Preventing this deterioration requires maintaining clear connections between your use of authority and objectives that extend beyond your personal position. You must be able to articulate why your standards matter and how they serve interests that others share. When you cannot explain why something deserves enforcement beyond "because I said so," you are probably crossing the line into arbitrary exercise of power. The most effective safeguard involves cultivating relationships with people whose judgment you trust and who have permission to challenge your decisions when they believe you are making mistakes. This requires genuine humility about your own fallibility and commitment to objectives larger than your immediate convenience. You must also maintain regular contact with the human cost of your decisions. Leaders who delegate all enforcement to others can lose sight of how their policies affect real people. Staying connected to these consequences helps maintain the emotional balance necessary for ethical leadership. The goal is to develop a form of authority that others respect because it serves purposes they can understand and support, rather than fear that exists purely to serve your ego. When people believe that challenging your authority would harm objectives they care about, they become willing participants in maintaining your influence rather than reluctant subjects looking for opportunities to escape or rebel. This approach creates sustainable power that grows stronger over time rather than requiring increasingly severe enforcement to maintain. It allows you to achieve your objectives while preserving your humanity and maintaining relationships that provide both practical support and personal satisfaction. The ultimate expression of political wisdom lies in creating systems that work, whether people like you or not, ensuring that your influence extends beyond personal relationships to institutional frameworks that operate according to principles rather than personalities. During my years studying various forms of government, I learned that the most successful leaders build infrastructure that makes their authority both necessary and sustainable. Personal charisma and individual relationships, while important, represent the weakest form of power because they depend entirely on your continued presence and energy. The leader who relies solely on personal influence discovers that their authority evaporates the moment they become unavailable, distracted, or less compelling than they once were. True political infrastructure creates systems where your objectives are advanced even when you are not directly involved. Creating systems that transcend personal relationships requires establishing processes, standards, and consequences that operate consistently regardless of who implements them. When I observed successful republics and principalities, I noticed that their stability came not from the wisdom or virtue of individual leaders, but from institutional frameworks that channeled self-interest toward productive outcomes. In modern organizations, this means establishing clear criteria for decisions, transparent processes for evaluation, and consistent consequences for performance. that operate independently of personal relationships or momentary preferences. When people understand that certain behaviors will always produce specific results, they adjust their actions accordingly without requiring your constant intervention. Building institutional power involves becoming associated with the systems and standards that others depend on for success. When you are seen as the architect or primary guardian of processes that benefit the organization, opposing you becomes equivalent to opposing the framework that enables everyone's success. This makes resistance not just difficult, but counterproductive for rational actors. The importance of having multiple sources of influence and security cannot be overstated. Leaders who depend on single relationships, single skills, or single positions remain vulnerable to changes beyond their control. The most secure approach involves developing several independent sources of value that would each be difficult to replace, and that together make your removal extremely costly. I learned to cultivate influence through expertise, relationships, process knowledge, historical memory, and strategic positioning simultaneously. If any single source of power was threatened, the others provided backup and recovery options. This redundancy created stability that allowed for long-term planning and relationship building. Creating dependency through institutional knowledge represents one of the most sustainable forms of influence. When you become the person who understands how things really work, who knows the history behind current policies, and who can navigate complex bureaucratic requirements, you become indispensable regardless of formal authority. This knowledge-based power grows stronger over time rather than weaker. The strategic documentation of processes, decisions, and relationships serves both practical and political purposes. From a practical standpoint, good records improve decision-making and organizational learning. From a political standpoint, being known as someone who maintains accurate, comprehensive documentation makes others more careful about their commitments and more likely to honor their agreements. Understanding succession planning from a political perspective means ensuring that your departure would create sufficient disruption to make your attention clearly preferable. This doesn't require making yourself irreplaceable through sabotage or information hoarding, but rather through becoming so deeply integrated into important processes that transition would require significant time and effort. The most sophisticated approach involves mentoring others in ways that create loyalty while building organizational capability. When you develop people who owe their advancement to your guidance and who share your understanding of how things should work, you create a network of influence that extends beyond your direct participation. Building alliances with institutional stakeholders, those who benefit from current systems and processes, provides natural support for maintaining stability. These relationships often prove more durable than personal friendships because they are based on mutual benefit rather than just affection or shared history. The goal is to create a situation where maintaining your influence serves the interests of enough important people that opposition becomes isolated and ineffective. When rational calculation clearly favors supporting your continued authority, you achieve security that doesn't depend on fear, charisma, or constant effort to maintain. Temporary victories mean nothing without sustainable systems that compound your advantages over time and position you to weather the inevitable changes in political fortune. During my observation of Italian politics, I witnessed countless leaders who achieved dramatic short-term success only to lose everything when circumstances shifted, because they had built their power on foundations that could not adapt to new realities. The cyclical nature of political power demands that you prepare for both success and setbacks, understanding that today's advantage may become tomorrow's liability if not properly managed. The leader who assumes that current conditions will persist indefinitely will be blindsided by changes that more prescient rivals anticipated and prepared for. Building influence that compounds over time requires focusing on investments that become more valuable as they mature, rather than seeking immediate payoffs that provide temporary benefit. Relationships based on mutual respect and shared success grow stronger over years of interaction. Reputation for competence and reliability becomes more valuable as it is tested and confirmed through various challenges. I learned that the most powerful form of compound influence comes from helping others achieve their objectives in ways that they attribute to your guidance or support. When people believe that their success is connected to their relationship with you, they become invested in maintaining and strengthening that relationship. This creates a network of individuals who benefit from your continued influence and who will work to protect and advance your interests. The strategic cultivation of younger colleagues and subordinates represents one of the most overlooked aspects of long-term influence building. While others focus on managing up and cultivating relationships with current power holders, the wise leader also invests in people who will hold power in the future. Today's junior colleague may become tomorrow's decision maker. An early investment in these relationships often yields extraordinary returns. Understanding generational change and preparing for leadership transitions allows you to maintain influence even as formal power structures evolve. Rather than clinging to relationships with aging leaders or outdated systems, you must continuously adapt your network and approach to align with emerging realities while maintaining connection to established sources of influence, creating legacy and reputation that outlive immediate circumstances requires associating yourself with principles and achievements that retain value independent of current political arrangements. When you become known for consistent adherence to important standards or for contributions that benefit the organization beyond your personal interests, your influence becomes part of the institutional memory that shapes future decisions. The documentation and communication of your philosophy and methods ensures that your influence extends beyond your direct participation. When others understand not just what you do, but why you do it, they can continue applying your principles even when you are not present to provide guidance. This creates a form of intellectual inheritance that multiplies your impact. Preparing for the inevitable changes in power dynamics means developing skills and relationships that remain valuable regardless of who holds formal authority. Technical expertise, process knowledge, relationship networks, and reputation for effectiveness transfer across different organizational structures and leadership styles. The most sophisticated practitioners understand that true security comes from making their success inseparable from the success of the institutions they serve. When your advancement clearly correlates with organizational achievement, rational leaders will support your influence, regardless of personal preferences, because opposing you would harm their own interests. I observed that leaders who survived multiple political upheavals shared certain characteristics. They maintained relationships across different factions. They contributed to institutional rather than just personal success. They adapted their methods while maintaining consistent principles, and they positioned themselves as valuable to whoever held power rather than as threats to be eliminated. The goal is to create a form of influence that becomes self-sustaining because it serves purposes larger than your immediate interests. When people see that supporting your authority advances objectives they care about, they become willing partners in maintaining your influence rather than reluctant subjects looking for alternatives. This approach requires patience and long-term thinking that may seem inefficient compared to more direct methods of gaining immediate advantage. But the compound returns on this investment eventually create levels of security and effectiveness that cannot be achieved through tactics focused only on short-term gain. The ultimate measure of political success is not the height of power you achieve, but the duration and impact of your influence on the institutions and people you serve. As I reflect on the lessons I have shared with you, I am reminded of the profound loneliness that accompanies the effective exercise of power and the terrible responsibility that comes with understanding how to shape human behavior. The knowledge I have given you is both a gift and a burden, for once you see the world as it truly operates, you can never return to the comfortable illusions that sustain those who remain powerless. The cost of wielding influence effectively is the constant awareness that your relationships are shaped by calculation as well as affection, that your reputation depends on careful management rather than natural virtue, and that your security requires eternal vigilance rather than trust in others' goodwill. This knowledge isolates you from those who still believe that good intentions and moral purity will somehow triumph over strategic thinking and careful preparation. Yet someone must be willing to accept this burden, for the alternative is to leave power in the hands of those who exercise it poorly, damaging both the institutions they lead and the people they serve. The leader who refuses to master these principles doesn't become more virtuous. They simply become less effective at advancing any cause, including virtuous ones. The necessity of fear-based leadership stems not from human evil, but from human nature itself. People respond to incentives, and those incentives must include both rewards for cooperation and consequences for opposition. The leader who can provide only rewards will eventually be taken advantage of by those who recognize that cooperation is optional. The leader who relies only on punishment will provoke rebellion when people conclude that resistance cannot make their situation worse. The greater good often requires actions that appear harsh when viewed in isolation, but that prevent far greater suffering when understood in context. The executive who enforces standards strictly may seem cruel to individual employees, but creates an environment where everyone can succeed because expectations are clear and fairly applied. The negotiator who demonstrates willingness to walk away may appear unreasonable, but achieves better outcomes for everyone they represent. Your choice now is not between being good and being effective, but between being effectively good or ineffectively powerless. The moral leader who cannot influence outcomes serves no one's interests, while the strategic leader who understands these principles can advance worthy causes that would otherwise fail due to political naivety. If you choose to embrace these teachings, remember that power is a tool for serving purposes larger than yourself, not an end in itself. The moment you begin to value your authority more than the objectives it enables you to achieve, you begin the transformation into the very type of leader these principles were designed to constrain. Use fear sparingly, but decisively. Build relationships, strategically but genuinely. Control information carefully but fairly. Make alliances conditionally but honorably. Demonstrate consequences reluctantly but consistently. Present yourself confidently but truthfully. Above all, remember that the ultimate test of your leadership is not whether you are loved or feared, but whether the institutions and people you serve are better for your influence. The world needs leaders who understand how power actually works, and who are willing to exercise it responsibly in service of worthy goals. It needs people who can navigate political realities without being corrupted by them, who can use strategic thinking to advance moral purposes, and who can accept the loneliness of leadership in exchange for the ability to make a positive difference. These principles have guided effective leaders for over 500 years because they reflect truths about human nature that do not change regardless of technology, culture, or political systems. They will serve you well if you apply them with wisdom, restraint, and commitment to purposes worthy of the effort required to master them. The choice is yours. Remain powerless but pure, or embrace the complexity of true influence and accept the responsibility that comes with the ability to shape outcomes. History will judge you not by your intentions but by your results. And results require mastering the tools that actually move human behavior, rather than those we wish would work. Go forth and lead wisely, but lead effectively. The world has enough well-intentioned failures. It needs more people who understand how to turn good intentions into lasting positive change.